Welcome to Eat, Sleep, Wine, Repeat, a podcast for all you wine lovers who, if you're like me, just cannot get enough of the good stuff. I'm Yanina Dore, your host, brand ambassador, wine educator, and sommelier. So stick with me as we dive deeper into this ever-evolving, wonderful world of wine. And wherever you are listening to this, cheers to you. Hello, wine friends, and welcome back to the first episode of 2023. And I am starting in style. I hope one of your resolutions is to learn more about wine, as I am taking you to a wine region that for many, including myself, are not so familiar with. And that is the Jura region in France. I have wine expert, geography expert, even history expert. It really seems like there is nothing this guy doesn't know. Jimmy Smith talking to us today. Now, Jimmy is literally one of the best wine educators out there. You'll hear through this podcast all about Jimmy's wine schools, his YouTube channel, Wine with Jimmy, and his other wine businesses. He's even making wine now in England. So anybody wanting motivation for setting up their own business, you'll enjoy the first part where I work out how Jimmy has got himself into the world of wine. Then a few fun wine disaster stories. And we will then get into the nitty gritty of Jura about 16 minutes or so into this episode. It is jam-packed. It's a little over an hour. Oops. But I promise you, Jimmy is just full of wine gems. I could not cut them out. So pour yourself a glass of wine and let's go. Jimmy, are you ready to bring your superpower, which is educating us all on wine?
I could just about manage. Yeah, no, I can do it. I'm in my zone. I'm in the zone.
Yes. Okay. And as we already discussed, we haven't drunk any wine yet. So, you know, your brain's completely there.
I'm definitely better when I've had a few. So.
Oh God. So we're not getting you in your best, your best moment.
It depends who you talk to, I suppose.
Well, let's see how this goes. Now, I want to know, how did you get the wine bug?
Well, you have to cast your mind back a long time to...
I'm ready.
Some people call it the Dark Ages. And...
The Dark Ages? How old are you again?
Well, let me finish the sentence. The Dark Ages of wine retailing. I actually come from not a wine background, so my parents were teetotal. So I grew up in that kind of environment, and 3 older brothers started working in catering. They're all between 4 and 10 years older than me. And I was the last to join that kind of process. At the age of 16, I started working. I'm from Lincolnshire, in a nice sort of sleepy town. I started working in restaurants and was poached by the local wine shop, a wine rack.
Oh, okay.
It was Christmas time, and I was doing my thing, talking about some of the wines on the list, and the manager of the wine shop was very excited because he had lost one of his members of staff, and then suddenly there's a vacancy, and he was hearing me talk about it. It was like, oh, how would you like to work in the wine shop? And I was like, well, actually, yeah, I would. I was kind of quite annoyed. Can I use foul language? Am I allowed to?
Yes, you can.
Okay, good.
I have the explicit label, just in case.
I was quite pissed off, of course, as you would be at Christmas time working in a restaurant. So if anybody had offered me anything, to be honest, at that time, I would have took it. And I did my WSET, level 2, level 3. I passed at the age of 18.
Oh my God, now that is impressive.
Yeah, I think I was the youngest
at
at the time, but probably much younger than me now. But yeah, and then I became the assistant manager and then manager of that place in the year that I had off before university. I went to university at the age of like 19, 20, and I'd done all my wine qualifications. So basically that sort of time in my life where most kids have absolutely no idea what they want to do and no direction. They're just kind of swimming in multiple directions. Then for me, that was it. I was like, well, I want to do this. And I went to university. It's a long story, but I ended up doing geography. And
that's okay, of course.
Yeah, but I didn't start off doing it. I started off doing mechanical engineering at Newcastle, which I was terrible at. And I actually switched on the second day. I went to the geography department of the social sciences, and I said, have you got any space on the geography course? And they went, actually, we have. Come in for an interview. And I talked to my tutor. He became my tutor for 30 minutes about wine, and that was it. And he was like, "You should do a dissertation on wine. You know, the human geography of wine." And I was like, "Done." And he was like, "You're on board." And it was amazing because I managed to cheat the UCAS system here in the UK.
Oh, I love it when you can do that. Right?
Well, yeah,
tell us all.
I think I needed like an ABB to get geography at Newcastle University, and I didn't have anywhere near that, needless to say. But I did this backdoor approach, and I got in, and I, succeeded. Got a 2-1, and I knew before I started that course what I wanted to do, and I came down to London and started working within Wine Rack again. So I started opening up some of their new brand wine racks, working with Oz Clarke at the time.
That's cool.
Yeah, and that's where it all started, yeah. So the real sort of seminal moment for me was just a bit before that. How I got the wine bug in that restaurant was... the restaurant that I ended up leaving, I was poached from, they brought in a supplier. It was an Italian restaurant, so they brought in a supplier. They did a tasting of Brunello di Montalcino, Chianti Classico, Barolo, some lovely wines. Yep. Bearing in mind, I was like 17. The guy who led the tasting was like, "Actually, you've got a really good palate for a 17-year-old. And I went, "Oh, I don't even know what that means, but thanks." And that's what kind of, the butterfly effect from that moment, I think.
I love it. Yeah, well, it's not bad to start with a little bit of Barolo, is it? As one of your first wines.
No.
Now, tell me, where is the one wine memory that you have that just sticks and says, "Yes, this is it. I'm never leaving this industry." Is that tough?
It is tough. Basically, they all stem around, I think, my camper van.
Oh, that's cute.
Yeah, I have a 1971 Volkswagen camper van called Jeff.
Jeff, okay.
And after Jeff Goldblum, of course. That's a story for another day.
Another one.
I bought him 12 years ago, so in 2010. We have a number of... when I say we... Me and my chief wine buyer, one of my best friends, was my best man at my wedding. We did these trips together in the years before my kids came along. And we did so many wonderful visits. But I think one that really sticks in my mind is not necessarily a visit or the wine that really kind of floated my boat or anything like that. But it was just a moment in time which I absolutely love. We were driving, and this is when we had a TomToms. This is like 10 years ago.
Oh my God. Does anyone actually have TomToms?
I know.
They were so on trend, weren't they?
I know, and it's just, and they were so sort of archaic. And we had this Irish lady dictating to us, through the TomTom. But she took us through the wrong part of the Côte d'Or. So we should have gone around the Côte d'Or, around the hills, but it took us right through the middle of it.
Oh, well, I bet that ended up being quite amusing.
Well, it was,
quite
because it was hammering it down. It was kind of monsoon-like rainfall at that time. So we're in a leaky 1971 Volkswagen bus, and it's taking us down this backwater road, which ends up being... in the middle of a vineyard. So above us, you can see vines coming down a gentle slope, and then below us, a quite steep slope. Quite close. This is around the area like Saint-Aubin, Saint-Romain, just in the hills from Chassaing-Montrachet. I turn around to Matt sitting next to me and say, we're not going to get through this. We're going to have to turn back. So I started doing a 3-point turn, which ended up being a 60-point turn to try and get
between
back.
the vines?
In between the vines, and then there's almost like so much soil erosion going on here that because it was so heavy that we were then perched over this precipice, over this slope, and we were slowly inching down it, very slowly, and the reverse was not working. And then I said, Matt, you're going to have to get out and hold the van in place. So Matt gets out in the absolute monsoon rain. So I don't know if you know a Volkswagen camper van, but it has a flat front, right, with a nice little nose on the front of it where the tyre goes. Yeah. So he's pushing right there. He's right close to me because I'm at the steering wheel. So we're kind of about 3 feet away from each other. He's drenched, he's like a drowned rat. And I'm sitting in the car looking very worried because we're still not really getting anywhere. And this pursues for about 5 minutes. And then I'm like, I'm starting to think of my MacGyver moment. I'm like, shit, I've got to think of something here. And we'd just been to Champagne previously because this is Burgundy. We'd just been to Champagne. And I was like, Matt, I'm going to put a case of wine on the reverse so it keeps it in place. I'm going to empty the champagnes and I'm going to use the cardboard as tracks.
You're going to empty the champagnes?
No, empty the boxes of champagne.
Oh, thank God. I mean,
but I'll get to that phrase will actually come true in a second, though, the one you've just picked on.
No,
positively.
Okay.
So then I used the cardboard under each tyre, hoping it would work, but not really having much faith, and lo and behold, it did. And we managed to get up the slope reversing. I mean, the van went into a bunch of vines. I think we caused a bit of damage. No. But there was no one to tell, and
moving on.
I don't think it was too bad. But then we stopped the van and we picked up all the cardboard, which was just caked in mud. We were both soaked at that point. I mean, Matt probably more so than me. But then I just said champagne, and we emptied a couple of bottles of champagne
into your mouths, though.
Yeah, into our mouths. I think one was a Pierre Payard Bouzy Grand Cru, and I cannot remember the other one. But we sat there in the middle of the Bourgogne Côte de Beaune, basically just escaping a scenario which could have been a disaster, drinking champagne in the rain, and we sat out in the rain for about 10 minutes. It's not necessarily one that goes, yeah, that's the best champagne ever, or the best, It was just a wonderful moment in time where we're drinking champagne in Burgundy because we saved the van's life,
Hurrah!
So there you are.
Do you know what? I have a not so dramatic story that's similar to yours, which is driving through Val di Biardene, obviously those lovely steep hills in Prosecco land, and our sat nav at the time, and I'm thinking back, this probably was potentially 10 years ago, and basically middle of the night, driving back from a restaurant, and it decides to take us completely smack bang through the middle of a vineyard, vines on both sides. We're in, I think probably a Cinquecenta. So it's really low, really small. Mm-hmm. All the stones are just banging underneath the car. Doo, 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 doo. And we're like, oh my God. And we'd committed too much. It was so steep where we were. We were like, we're in this tiny little car. It's not going to have the strength to take the two of us probably back up. So we just committed to it. And I mean, long story short, we're fine. It was fine. But for like 2 or 3 minutes, we're like, oh my God, this car is going to fall apart. And we're going to literally damage somebody's vineyard. But, your story is better.
I've got a whole host of those. I'll give you a very short one as well. This is in Alsace. My van has come to our rescue. We'd just been to Domaine Weinbach with Catherine Faller, the late Catherine Faller, and we tasted through, Alsace. They probably have 10 varieties, making 30, 40 different wines. We tasted all those wines. Then we'd had a bit of lunch where I'd had a couple of beers, and then we were driving. And I was absolutely fine, but with the gendarmes in France, you never really know. And we were driving on the wine route, and then we were asked to pull over by a collection of gendarmes that were standing there, the police, and they were just pulling over random vehicles. So they pull us over, I look at Matt, and I'm like, oh shit, here we go. And then he kind of symbols to me to wind down my window, and it takes about a good minute to wind down the window. So he got quite frustrated with that. And then he said, please, arrêtez le moteur. And I was like, well, if I stop the motor, if I stop the engine, he won't start again for about 30 minutes. And there's like a whole line of cars behind me. And then he goes off and confers with his other policeman, comes back and says, I'll just go on. And we drove off, and I was like, yes! Oh my God. And my camper van, my camper van coming to my rescue.
Actually saved you.
My knight in shining orange armour.
Good old Jeff. Now, tell me, at what point did you decide you wanted to be in wine education?
I started working for the retail group, Thresher Group, opening their wine rack stores. Mm-hmm. I'd already had my level 3, and then they were putting me through my diploma, so they were paying for my diploma. And I found out the structure of how that retail chain was delivering WSE's courses, which was absolutely
atrocious.
Archaic, haphazard. It was horrendous. And I couldn't believe it. And I started teaching as a part of this. That's how I kind of got to know it. Mm-hmm. It was just an absolute mess. So then I had the kahunas really to come up with a business plan. I went to see the CEO at the time of Thresher Group, had a meeting with him and said, look, we currently have about 20 tutors. There's absolutely no direction to the teaching, and a lot of it is exceptionally, let's say, challenging. I was being quite diplomatic with my wording. And I said, this is what you should do. You should have a smaller amount, maybe 5 or 6. It should be centralized. There should be one person leading it, me. And please look into it. You'd save this amount of money, you'll get better results, and all this kind of stuff.
Amazing.
And they accepted it. And then I became their head of education at the age of 24, 25 years old. Yeah. And then I held that post for a couple of years, but it was really getting to the tail end of that company. They were being run into the ground by a succession of different owners, and that all fell apart. So I also launched the Wine Rack Wine School.
Did you?
With a guy called Quentin Sadler, who is fairly very well known in the trade, also teaches for me still to this day. So we launched
Has a good business card.
He does, yeah, with the
cartoon drawing of him.
Exactly, yeah. He quite likes that. And that's how it all started. But they went into administration in 2007. I found myself at a bit of a loose end, and I decided to do a bit of research. I had no financing, so I had no money behind me, so I couldn't go off and do my own thing. So I joined a new franchising network called the Local Wine School Network, which was set up by a gentleman up in Newcastle. And he was looking for the first people to join it, and I inquired, and I said, look, I currently live in West London, and I'd love to set up the franchise of West London Wine School for your franchise network. Being a franchise network, you only needed a certain amount of money, a much smaller amount of money to join it. And bear in mind, I was only probably at this age, about 26, 27. No money behind me and little business acumen. I needed a lot of help in terms of, search engine optimization, website design and all that kind of stuff. And it seemed like it was the right fit at the time, and it certainly was. And yeah, I launched West London Wine School in Fulham, and now it's, as you know, the rest is history. It's one of the largest wine schools in the UK, and yeah.
And here we are. We're missing out quite a little bit. But now, I said to you, because you are fantastic at calmly and clearly educating people on wine regions, I asked you to give me a selection of old world wine regions that you might want to talk about. And one of them was Jura. And I am so not good with Jura because I don't drink enough of it. In fact, I don't remember the last time I had a Jura. Maybe about 5 years ago. Is that terrible?
No, it's not. It's not at all. I mean, it's a very small wine region. It's only about 2,000 hectares, and then most of the time it's decimated by frost. So it's really, there's not much of it available. It's very much desired by East London Shoreditch types and New Yorkers. It's kind of a bit of a stereotypical hipster sort of wine style these days, or can be anyway. But there's so much wonderful stuff to be found from Jura. It's an amazing area. I think it was Andrew Jefford who said, if you want to get a glimpse of what good wine might have tasted like in the time of Shakespeare, then you look here.
Oh, that's interesting. And actually, back in the past as well, you say that there's like 2,000 hectares. There was like 10 times as much. This region used to be a hell of a lot bigger, right?
Yeah, Jura is a wonderful little area. It's within the French Comté, which of course is known for cheese.
Comté cheese!
Yeah, which is the most exported cheese out of France, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful in all of its guises. And yeah, you're right. Before the advent of railway, before the onslaught of phylloxera, and also before the increase of beer production, Jura was huge. It was producing, 20,000 hectares, very much sort of filtering that into places like Switzerland, Austria, northern Italy, and of course a lot of sort of eastern France. And they were doing very well, but then comes along the likes of beer production, and the French start to drink more beer and people drink less of these regional wines. Then the railway connects places like Marseille up to Avignon, to Lyon, to Dijon, to Beaune, and suddenly all these cheap southern wines start to flood into all the markets. And then phylloxera comes along and really puts the nail in the coffin. And, after all of these succession of setbacks, and there's also a lot of social economical issues going on at the time, basically the growers went, fuck it, we can't be bothered. They just went, there's too much competition, there's just too many problems, it's too wet, there's too many, vineyard issues. And it really, really sort of diminished to a tenth of its size, with a few stout-heart individuals carrying on the baton. But yeah, it's very small today, but was once quite large, yeah, for sure.
But like you said, that, it's really wet and it's rainy. There is so much more rainfall there than if you compare it to where we are in London, right? Loads more rainfall.
Yeah, so it's eastern France. It sits in the foothills of the Alps, and the Alps therefore sits to the eastern side of it. And if you know a little bit about geography of France, the major, and it's the same with England as well, the major air mass is the westerly wind that comes from the Gulf Stream. And this is what batters, most of the west of France. That's what batters Ireland and Cornwall and in the UK, Wales, for example. So this is quite far away. So logically thinking, you're like, well, it's not right on the west, but the issue is that there's not really much on the eastern side to protect it against the prevailing westerly winds. So places like in the Rhone Valley to the south has the huge central uplift of the Massif Central, and that has a lot of protection. The wind that comes from the west is channeled into Bordeaux, or it goes north of that. So the Loire, and then heads towards the Paris Basin, where it's then pulled a little bit down towards places like Burgundy and then hits the Alps. And it hits the Alps at south of Alsace. So it hits either the Vosges at Alsace, and it doesn't get Alsace. Alsace is only about 400, 500 millimetres of rain a year because it sits on the right side, literally the right side of the Vosges.
in
both senses. Whereas what's to the direct west of Jura, the direct west of it is a big plain called the Bresse Plain, very famous for chicken, poulet de Bresse. And that's where the Saône River runs through, the beautiful Saône River, which runs down to the Rhône, it meets the Rhône, and it's flat. And then there's some hills, some gentle hills near Burgundy, but really it just gets this momentum, and then it hits a big brick wall, which is the huge Alps, and it rains. And that's what rainfall generally does. It hits a big geographical feature, rains there, and what's below that is Jura. So it gets very wet, yeah. I mean, typically sort of 1,200, 1,100 millimetres of rain, which puts it on par with like Devon, Dorset, Cornwall, but as you rightly said, twice as rainy really as kind of southeast of England. To most people's surprise, we're quite dry here.
I know. And that's all we do. We moan about the rain. So okay, we've talked about the fact that, it rains a lot, but this is a, moderate continental climate, very close to Burgundy, right? In terms of where does it sit in France? Yeah,
it's eastern France, as I mentioned. So if you go to the east, it's the mountains, the foothills, got lots of lovely pristine lakes up there, great skiing, of course, when you get to the Swiss border. But as you head to the west, you come down to the plains, the Bresse Plains, you come down to the Saône River, you cross the Saône River, and then you're in Burgundy. And if you were to drive from Dijon or Beaune in the Côte d'Or, so north of the Côte d'Or and in the Côte d'Or, to the major populace of the wine area of Jura, which is Arbois, it's about 45 minutes, 50 minutes.
Yeah, it's not far,
is it? It's very close. And it's brilliant because if you do go to Burgundy and visit, of course you do very classic, you go through the Côte d'Or and you visit all those beautiful villages, some great producers, you go to Beaune, you have some good gastronomy. But honestly, just to get away from that very expensive part of the trip, just a quick hop over for a couple of days to Jura is absolutely fantastic. Very close and very different. I mean, very similar grape varieties on one side, that's Chardonnay and Pinot, but then different grape varieties. Geologically speaking, it's different. And that creates a real counterpoint to Burgundy's styles. And nothing could be more evident in Chardonnay. If you compare a classic Chardonnay from Meursault, Puligny-Montrachet, Beaune or whatever, compared to Jura, there are significant differences. And that is because of everything we're talking about, terroir, geology, philosophy, all those kind of things.
Well, what is the terroir? First of all, we know it rains, but in terms of soils, in terms of, how does it differ from Burgundy? I mean, actually, I love the fact that Jura, the name comes from the Jurassic era, right? Yep. And that's to do with the soils.
Yeah, the etymology of Jura actually originally stems back to a Celtic word, which means forested, a forested mountain. And then the word Jurassic is stemmed from that as well. So it's kind of Jurassic and Celtic etymology. The geology is much more on the clay side and much more on the mudstone. Having a geography and geology degree behind me, I can't stand wine speak when it gets so ridiculously pretentious. So the word marl, which you've probably heard of before, M-A-R-L, it does not exist in geology. It's not a thing.
Does it not?
No, in geology we call it mudstone, which is a combination of limestone and clay. But of course, mudstone makes it sound shit. So of course, it's been changed into something that sounds a bit sexier.
Well, it does sound better than mudstone.
Yeah, so marl is more clay-based. So you've got these clay-based soils, but you do have it generally on limestone bedrock. So there's generally fairly decent drainage, but it's not really about the drainage. There are these different types of rocks that we find, grey types rocks. The marl is either red marl, grey marl, blue marl, different types of minerals found within them. But the key difference is that Jura has about 80% marl, mudstone and clay to only about 20% limestone, whereas Burgundy is the other way round. So whereas you find a Chardonnay in Burgundy on limestone, which gives you that precise character, high acidity, with an excellent ability to age, but often a delicacy. Whereas Jura Chardonnays tend to have weight, roundness,
fruitiness, a bit fruitier.
Yeah, definitely a bit of a riper character. And then the winemaking wise, they can often work a little bit more oxidatively as well, where you can find savoury elements to those wines too. But the terroir is very different, and it's because it's the Saône River, which runs as the dividing line between Jura and Burgundy. Is a depression. It's what we call a graben, or a trench, which has been sunk by tectonic activity. So plates have moved and it's sunk. And then on each side of the sinking of this, you find the hills of Burgundy and then the mountains of Jura. And then you get lots of erosion, which have then really sort of surfaced those different soils, and that's why we have such a mosaic of terroirs in both of those areas. So
yeah, interesting. But you mentioned Chardonnay and the differences, which is really interesting.
Yeah,
Pinot Noir does like clay, and it often, so in Burgundy, a lot of the Pinot Noir can be planted on more clay soils. So would that mean that the Pinot Noirs are not as different, potentially? How would you separate a Pinot Noir from Jura?
Pinot Noir is a grape variety which, out of the 5 varieties of Jura, so there are the 5 grape varieties, of which you have Chardonnay and Sauvignon, which are your 2 whites, and then you have Trousseau, Pulsard, and Pinot Noir as your 3 reds. They're the 5 that are permitted for AOC and all types of AOC Jura wines. The Pinot Noir variety is generally historically grown for sparkling in this area.
Ah, okay, all right.
So a lot of the clones of Pinot Noir that have been planted
are they champagne clones?
are champagne and sparkling clones. So you don't tend to get a huge amount of density behind the Pinot Noirs of this area. Plus the area is a bit cooler, a bit wetter, and that is changing. There are certainly some better Pinot Noirs coming from around Arbois and Pupillon, so kind of towards the north of the area. But it's not the focus. The focus, most of the Pinot goes into Clément de Jura, and then the Trousseau and the Pulsard is certainly the focus varieties.
Okay, interesting. I didn't know that. And actually, for anybody listening who doesn't understand what we mean by champagne clones, they are always higher in acidity, which is ideal for making a sparkling. Whereas if you were to use Burgundy clones, they have more ripeness. They're going to reach different sugar levels, which will give you more flavours. So again, if you use a champagne clone to make a still Pinot, it's not really going to be very good, which, by the way, is what has happened in England and is very rapidly changing.
Well, actually, the Pinot that I'm making here at Beare Green Winery is made from a champagne clone, but we are making...
Interesting. And you're making a still?
We are making a still, yeah.
Wow, controversial. Would you like to debate with me what I've just said?
Well,
bring it.
It depends. I mean, your statement is generally correct, but as with all statements in the world of wine, it comes with caveats, because the word generally is what you should always put in front of most statements, right? Because generally you are correct, but there are some types of champagne clones which are a little bit more like still wine clones, and we're lucky enough to have one of those. Plus, the vintage, the first vintage that we've produced, which is this year, 2022, has been a belter of a year. The fruits come in such good condition, and it all hinged on Mother Nature. So if our fruit had come in, in poorer conditions, we would have probably made a sparkling or a pet nat from those grapes, but we were exceptionally happy with the quality. I've also employed quite an interesting amount of tricks, which has nothing to do with intervention in terms of, yeast and all that kind of stuff. It's being clever and being very innovative. I'm not saying I'm clever, I'm just I try to say that you have to be creative, and that's what we've done with our Pinot, and it's currently happily sitting at the minute in new oak barrels, which we purchased from Danbury up in Essex.
Okay.
Which actually comes all the way back round to my camper van, which is a Danbury Essex Volkswagen camper van. So,
oh, that's so funny. So this Pinot that you have picked, now put in barrels to make your wine, which will be your first ever wine, right?
Yeah.
And just everyone, this is England. We've just popped back to England for a second, everyone. We're taking a pause on the Jura story. Where is the grapes grown?
So we are preparing land here. So where I live, on the Surrey-Sussex border, where my family is bedded in here, we have a wonderful amount of land. We're very lucky to have this. And we're preparing that land for viticulture. We just haven't got round to planting it yet. So we will have estate grapes going into our wine eventually, but that's probably about 4 or 5 years off yet. Therefore, we're acting as a negociant. So we have a winery here. We have stainless steel vats, we have a press, we have barrels, we have a laboratory. We have a nice small artisanal boutique winery where we can crush probably up to about 10 tons. So we can make something like 8,000 bottles, something along those numbers.
Brilliant, it's exciting.
But this year we only crushed 1 ton because it was our first year. The winery only got fully complete. The builders left in September, so then the fruit came in October. So it's it was really sort of very much close to the wire, and the grapes we sourced from a farmer in Sussex. So we're Surrey-Sussex border, but on the Surrey side. If you go about half an hour south of here, you are very close to Brighton, and that's where our grapes are sourced. It was about a ton of mainly Champagne varietals. So the Pinot Noir and the Meunier are Champagne varietals. The Chardonnay, though, is a Dijon clone, 95 Dijon clone Chardonnay.
Okay.
They were selling fruit to a much larger producer, their fruit, the previous year, but they got very upset with how they were treated. They broke away from that said larger producer, and then that's when we came along and said, we'll buy them, and they were very happy to deal with us because we're much smaller, and we're making still wine, which they're very excited about as well. So we brought the fruit in on the 12th of October. We processed it, then when I say we, it's me and my partner. The business for the winery is owned by my wife and I. My wife and I own all the businesses. We have five wine businesses, 2 wine schools, a wine bar, online wine business, and this winery. And this winery...
just a few.
Yes, just a few. 2 kids, 2 dogs, and a big house as well. But
and don't forget Jeff.
And Jeff, yeah, he's probably lacking in maintenance because of all the other stuff that goes on. But we teamed up with a tutor of mine, a guy called Sam Hill, who works at my wine school. He is trained at Plumpton College as a grape grower and a winemaker. He has a degree at Plumpton College down in Brighton. And we have partnered together to make this wine.
Love it. Just a 2-man team. Now, what is the name of this winery?
The winery is called Beare Green Winery, Beare, which is the location. We're in a little sleepy village called Beare Green. And it's Beare Green Winery. So we're in the Surrey Hills, and we're just on the border of Sussex. The land we have here is clay. It's not mudstone or marl. It's clay, and it's clay loam soils. But it really is interesting. The growing season we had this year. Now we're not growing grapes yet, but I have a weather station and we're preparing...
Monitoring it.
Yeah, we're preparing data, and the year we had this year was crazy because up to October the 12th is when our grapes came in. We had only had 240 millimetres of rain from the 1st of January to the 12th of October, so 10 months.
Oh my God.
And my weather station now has recorded nearly 800 millimetres in total. So since the 12th of October, and we're now on the 23rd of December, coming to the end of the year, we've had an extra 600 millimetres. It's rained so much after harvest, which is the best time for it.
Is it true?
But it's been so damp, hasn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
So it's been so dry, but we're quite happy because clay soils, and if you talk to the guys down at, say, Gusbourne, Charlie Holland, they have a site on Chalk, which is Romney's Marsh, around Appledore area where the winery is, but then they have the site of clay down in Sussex, the other side of Sussex, and they are very excited about that because clay is becoming quite an interesting soil with the drop in the amount of rainfall we're having, which is decreasing in this area. So
there you go, everybody, watch out. Clay gives a lot of concentration, depth and fruitiness. I like clay. Now, when is that wine going to be out? Is that going to be maybe summertime next year? Summer 2023?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's our first one. So we're making 1 white, 1 red. We have Chardonnay in stainless steel. It's not in barrel because we didn't have enough to put it in barrel. We have the Pinot Noir in barrel. And then we have another red, the Meunier and Pinot Noir blended together in another stainless steel vat. The desire is to blend all the red together to make 1 red, and then we'll have the white. They will spend as much time as they need to. The good thing about our winery, we're going to expand the production, but really it's much more love and passion in this. You know, we're not sitting down trying to cook the books and make it work financially. Of course, we want to try and make it work as financially.
That's always helpful.
Yeah, we want it to be balanced in some way, but we're quite keen on just making the best, and we're talking to a lot of growers around here to purchase their fruit, working with Ortega, Bacchus, Old Vine, Cheval Blanc to do some skin contact, some amphora style wines. We've got quite a lot of desires and passions to make some very interesting wines.
I think we'll have to get you back on the podcast with the wine when it's ready, won't we?
Yeah, for sure.
Now, would you be ever interested in bringing across any of the Jura grape varieties? Sauvignon, Pulsard and Trousseau?
Yeah, I know of some friends of mine who have planted Trousseau, so
in England?
In England, yeah. Okay. So definitely
Let's see.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I'm
Watch
more
this space.
I'm more I definitely would be interested in variety. I mean, Pulsar and Trousseau are interesting because they are fairly decent in cool climate, wet conditions, so they should be okay. I mean, Trousseau's a bit more of a challenging one because it's a bit more of a late ripener, but Pulsar you should be able to work with, and it depends on the clone, of course, as it always does.
Clones, generally speaking.
Yes, generally speaking.
Now, let's actually go to these 3 grape varieties so people can understand why they might want to drink them. And of course, so everyone, we've had a moment in England, and now we're going back to Jura. Pulsard, you know, this is actually really pale and light-bodied and beautiful red fruits with kind of, for me, a bit of an autumnal vibe. How would you describe Pulsard?
Yeah, Pulsar is historically you would say that Pulsar is actually more of a rosé than a red, and that's not through want of trying to make a red. It's exactly as you mentioned. It's exceptionally thin skinned. It's also known as Pulsar as well, so PL start as much as Pulsar. So it's has 2 kind of main synonyms behind it, and it's thought to be indigenous of the Jura area. It's been cultivated there for 500-600 years that we know of from written record, and apparently the name comes from this is where my French will be terrible. I think it's Pelos, which is a dialect for like wild plums.
Okay.
In kind of like Jurassic, so to speak. But yeah, it's remarkably thin skinned. It's also it's okay in wet weather, but it is prone to things like coulure, which is shedding of the blossom, and other issues around water. But it does ripen early, which is a benefit.
That could be good.
In this area, Jura is very well known for autumnal rains. So if you can get a grape that ripens early and then misses basically what's happened with England this year. On the 13th of October, it started to piss it down. It was kind of biblical, wasn't it? And for about 6 weeks in this country. So if you can get a grape that you actually pick really early, you miss that kind of running the gambit with autumnal rains, which I think is quite important. But yeah, we should probably mention a really important individual of Jura who was one of the biggest sort of protagonists for the variety. Pulsar, as well as Trousseau, was a guy that you'll know fairly well because you have things like pasteurization, which was created by him, and penicillin and a few other bits and bobs. Louis Pasteur was born in Arbois and was a Jura. He was a Jura man through and through, and in fact he lived in Arbois. And a lot of the locals used to walk by his laboratory, which is today a museum in Arbois, and they used to peer into the windows and look in and go, "My God, it looks like something out of Nostradamus." It was so, it was just so sort of epic in there, and he was so important for a number of things. But in terms of alcoholic production, he was the one who identified yeast strains.
Yeah, the yeast were the ones that were doing it, and it wasn't just magic.
Yes, exactly. It wasn't just some sort of spiritual thing happening. So he was good for that, and he was a huge flag flyer for the likes of indigenous variety, like Pulsar, for example.
Okay.
So the variety, pale-skinned, very red-fruited, and it oxidizes remarkably quickly. So if you make it reductively, and if you make it with a lot of protection, you can make a really gentle, very primary red-fruited style. But a lot of producers make it in a more rustic style where they allow oxidation. They might allow the fermentations to be a bit hotter. Pulsard's better at a little bit cooler ferments. And it's much better also with very, very limited amounts of pigeage, punching down, because you can find a little bit of astringency in the skins of those thin skins of Pulsar, which can create a herbaceous element, which actually you do find in Pulsar a little bit more common than not. So it's a variety that you can find it pristine, gentle, and almost like a delicate Sanso, with red fruit with less alcohol, of course, or as a real sort of savoury, it looks, even if it's a young wine, it could be garnety colour, have this sort of savoury element to it. You'll find it having dried fruits, sort of a gaminess, a meatiness to it. And that's because the oxidation has kind of taken hold of those kind of rustic styles. But they are generally, and this is a big thing in Jura, by the way, in Jura, you start with the reds, you finish with the whites, and then Vin Jaune. So if you ever do a Jura tasting, you begin with reds, you begin with Pulsar, and then Pinot and Trousseau, and then you go on to Chardonnay, then Sauvignon, and then things like Vin Jaune towards the end.
That's so interesting. I had no idea.
Yeah, that gives you a real insight into
the styles.
The styles. They are delicate and very, very gentle. And that's even with Pinot and most Trousseau as well. But then the whites are complex and concentrated and big, and they have a lot to shout about. They have elegance as well, but they are bigger than the reds.
Yes, because Trousseau has still quite got a light body, hasn't it? It's obviously darker fruited. It has a little bit more kind of spice to it and firmer tannins than what you're going to get from Pulsar, but it is bigger than Pulsar, isn't it?
Yes, Trousseau is a really interesting variety. It definitely is the variety which is the future for the most premium quality of the reds of Jura.
You think? Okay.
Yeah, Pulsar makes... there are some great Pulsards out there, but Château Renaud, for example, fantastic. But generally speaking, the Pulsard's on the lighter side of it. The Pinot, most of the fruit goes to sparkling, so then you're left with Trousseau. And there are certain clones, to bring clones up again, of Trousseau, and specifically the one called Trousseau à la Dame, or the ladies clone, which is phenomenal. It makes really concentrated expressions. Okay. But you are right. It is thin-skinned in terms of... So it actually has thicker skins than Pulsar, but thinner than what you would expect of other mainstay sort of black grapes. But its thickness in comparison to Pulsar means it actually is much more protective against fungal diseases.
Okay, a bit easier to work.
But it also needs ripening more. So it needs to be found on the best sites. It needs to be found on the warmer soils, better aspect. And it acts more like what we would expect a Pinot Noir to act like in Burgundy. It has more of that cherry to sort of plum area to it. There's a more elegant sort of balance to it. Good acidities again. A little bit more tannic structure than Pulsar. And the à la Dame clone can have much more structure as well. In comparison. Yeah, there's some cracking Trousseaus out there.
And for anybody who's ever had Merenzal from the northwest of Spain, it is, obviously we're talking clones, but this is the same grape variety, and Bastardo from Portugal, so you may have tried this variety.
And any variety that has a synonym of Bastardo is a friend of mine. I think it's just a it's just a wonderful... I mean, and that comes from how difficult it can be to grow. It's completely how... I have this conversation with a lot of people about naming of grapes, and it always comes back to Nebbiolo. And if anybody tells you that Nebbiolo, it's because of the fogs, we name it after the fogs, it's absolute bullshit. We name Nebbiolo because it has a foggy skin. It has a big, thick bloom to it, so it looks foggy. We always name grapes and vines after how they look.
The way they look.
Not after a climate, which can change very dramatically from one year to the other. So we know that Trousseau has a synonym Bastardo, and it's more likely of how... It's probably not likely to look like a bastard, but it's probably more...
What does a bastard look like anyway?
I don't know, exactly. It's more likely to act like it in the video. It's just a tricky little number.
That's so funny. So let's go across to Sauvignon. So the white grape variety, which also is known as Traminer.
Yes.
In other places. So there you go for everyone. I mean, the wonderful world of grapes having a million names.
Yeah.
But this was quite a cool grape because actually it went across to Australia, didn't it? And it was mistaken as Albarino for a while. I don't know if they've completely cleared that up.
This variety has had, lots of mistaking. The mistake of the Albarino thing comes from the institute in Galicia, one of the archive institutes of Galicia, mistakenly listing it as Sauvignon, Albarino as Sauvignon. And then that just then sort of spirals out of control, right? So this is classic though. Before DNA profiling, a lot of it was taken on botany and ampelography and, on how the vine looks, how the leaf shapes are. And of course, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. There's a lot of differences across that people can surmise from those. And you can understand why certain vines were called certain things. I mean, Tempranillo was thought to be Pinot Noir for most of its life until we thought how ridiculous that was.
I had no idea, really.
Yeah, it's because of the
Camino.
Yeah, the Camino to Santiago. Tempranillo is always one of the more elegant expressions of. This is before we had the onslaught of Mencía and all that kind of stuff. But Tempranillo wasn't as big as Garnacha, right, and Monastrell, and was like, well, it must come from France, then it must be more elegant, and it must be Pinot Noir.
If it's elegant, it has to be Pinot.
Yeah,
done.
exactly.
Okay.
And then monks were traversing the Camino de Santiago, the way of St. James, and they were like, well, there you go. It's been brought along from monks coming from Cluny or whatever and bringing it down. And that just is so commonplace. You can imagine just how it happened. You can just imagine somebody who has a few vines and someone says, oh, I want to buy these. What is it? And they go, actually, a few years ago, a guy told me it was this, but I think it might be this because I saw this, and then it just changes and changes and changes. But yeah, today we have DNA profiling, and you're exactly right to say Sauvignon Blanc, which is from Jura, is identical to the green grape Traminer, which is today a city found in the Alto Adige in the northern Italy, in Südtirol. And that was a part of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. That variety went off to mutate into Gewürztraminer, of course, Traminer to Gewürztraminer. And there is a mutation of Sauvignon as well, which is Sauvignon Rose, but José, which is...
Okay.
It's, if you mean to find it, you'll be very lucky. It's very, very limited amounts of it. It seems like the mutations were much more evident in the old Austro-Hungarian Empire.
So tell me about Sauvignon. What is Sauvignon?
I mean, this variety... is fucking off the charts. It's absolutely off the charts. It is...
In what way?
It is like eye-wateringly, enamel-strippingly acidic. It is exceptionally acidic.
Yes, it does have some good acidity. Good. Generally, it has good acidity.
Yes, exactly. It's very acidic. It's more than its sibling namesake as Sauvignon. It's more than Chenin. It's very, very high in acidity, and hence why in the past it's been worked very oxidatively, very much with flaw and very much with yeast. They work the hell out of Sauvignon to give it a counterpoint to its acidity, and that's why it works so well with those wine styles. So it's a traditional variety, which of course made its way across here. Now, this area is exceptionally well known for oxidative wine styles. It's less being made now, so oxidative meaning, of course, allowing the oxygen to affect it through the production and through maturation. And historically, that's what it's known for, and variations of that, underfloor, sous voile as well, which I'll touch on in a bit. But historically very well known. They're moving much more to, I hate to say it, but like more modern styles, but more, I was about to say cleaner wines, because that makes it sound like these old styles are unclean, but which is absolutely not what I'm saying. But more, more modern winemaking, the kind of German influenced, stainless steel. Clean is what I keep saying, but the kind of that style of wine is what they're moving towards today. But it is really the fame of the traditional style which put this wine on the map. There's a lovely castle found in Jura called Château de Châlons. And this was constructed by a nobleman called Jean de Châlons the First. Ooh, actually, that might be a lie. It might be the 13th. It's either the 1st
Somewhere
or the 13th.
between the 1st or the 13th. It's fine. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
This is where I have pockets in my memory, which are not the best. I don't have information at hand. But
so this dude,
this guy, he built a castle which has a really prominent outlook. It's on a hill that overlooks the Froitier Valley, which is just below it, so just in the middle of Jura. He builds a castle, and a village springs up around it, and it becomes quite famous in producing Sauvignon in this way of. Fairly low yields, but then putting it through an oxidative process where it's placed in barrels, like sherry would be, where it's not full to the top. It's often around 5-6 with ullage, and this really encourages the development of flaw, otherwise known in French as sous voile, meaning under yeast. and a nice thick film of flor develops. And it goes through the processes which, like a Manzanilla or a Fino will go through whilst it's sitting in barrel. It has the reaction between the alcohol and the yeast. The yeast is very happy as it's getting fed oxygen, it's getting fed nutrients from the wine itself, and a lot of reactions take place, and the wine becomes further enhanced and gets more complex from those compounds that are derived from that yeast. And it spends now these days there is a minimum amount of time it must spend in this process to actually be considered as what we call a vin jaune, which is yellow wine, because it turns into a yellowy colour. So Château Chalon, which is a place, a castle now with a village around it, produces exclusively vin jaune. Vin jaune is the style, and Château Chalon is a village, a castle that produces, it's about 50 hectares large. It produces it. It's probably known as the most famous expression of vin jaune. Now, these wines become famous, bearing in mind this landscape was part of the House of Savoy, the very famous family that dominated the Alpine passes, both on the eastern side of France and then the western side of Italy. And whatever wines these guys would drink, they tended to get put into the limelight. So the Marquis de Barolo started to present wines in Piemonte to the House of Savoy, and then Barolo becomes famous because it becomes known as the king of wines, the wine of kings, off the back of that. And on the French side of it, but still in the Savoy lands, this vin jaune starts to get served to nobility, clergy, aristocracy. Yeah, so it becomes really well known, this yellow wine of the Alps. So this wine then starts to give birth to this real following, and a big domestic following as well, where a big wine fair springs up. And this wine fair is today, and this is a big fact.
Is this the one in February?
It is. It is called the Percis de la Vin Jaune, so the piercing of the yellow wine. And it's held in February, which is a ridiculous month to hold it, but there we are. I've been to it a couple of times. I have freezed every part of my body in those conditions. It's very, very cold. It's like in that time of year, it's like -5, -6 degrees.
Fun.
You really have to sort of warm yourself up by fortifying yourself with these wines. And this festival attracts sort of 50, 60,000 people per year. And historically, what would happen, not at this festival, but in all of the small wineries, the small families that would make this vin jaune, they would have no way of assessing that wine whilst it sits for the 60 months, 70 months, or even much more, time in barrel. They basically put it in there, leave it, and when they open it up, 6, 7 years later, they pray that it's still wine and not vinegar. So the process of putting like a little ladle in there and piercing the film at the top of it, which is called the voile. That's called piercing the vin jaune, or piercing the yellow wine. You take then some wine out, taste it. There was a huge religious thing around this. They would pray, they would hope that this would be wine. Today, of course, we can manage the process, but they still emulate this old process. So you know what the French are like. They love their pomp and ceremony. So they have like 5 or 6 hours of stuff on stage, and lots of speeches, and lots of people getting awarded with things, hats and medals and all that kind of stuff. And then they have a couple of barrels sitting there. Of course, it's all been tested already, but they reenact what would be done in an old homestead, and they take out the bung, they put in a little ladle, they bring it out, and as they're bringing it out, very gently putting it into a glass, the crowd start to go, ooh, and then you get their typical sort of French, the pinkies up, they're tasting it and, really swashing it around the mouth, and then suddenly a big smile appears on the man's or the woman's face, and everyone starts cheering, and then they start passing around a lot of vin jaune, and you get drunk.
Oh, I love it. Oh, that sounds cold, but delightfully fun.
Yeah, it is. And once you get past the point of no return, you don't notice the cold, so it's fine.
Funny. So, of course, that is vin jaune, but obviously there are lots of Sauvignons that are not made in that style now, so people can have a fresh, as you said, clean.
Yes.
But a fresh style, which would be citrusy, floral, and I mean, they can be a little bit richer depending on, I guess, vintage and if they've been left on the vine a bit longer. But that's citrus floral style is what people should expect, right?
Yeah, I would say there are the 3 major types of Sauvignon. It isn't generally used for sparkling, so forget about that. It's generally used for 3 types. So Vin jaune styles, which we just talked about, really powerful, exceptionally tertiary, very nutty, with layers of spice behind it, and lots of complexity, bready, complexities behind it. Then a baby version of that. Some producers don't wish to go through the minimum amount of time that it has to spend in the barrel under yeast. Maybe they don't have the patience to put it through, the number always escapes. I think it's 60 months. It's something like 60 months. And maybe they want, okay, well, actually, I want to release something earlier. I want to do it for 2 years. The same process, but 2 years, maybe 2.5 years. They can't call it a Vin jaune because they haven't followed the process to its entirety, to the letter. So they have to label it as Sauvignon on the label. Sometimes they call it Tradition, so they'll say Sauvignon Tradition. And it will have what you mentioned. It will have that kind of citrus floral element, but then elements of what a Vin jaune will have. And they're fantastic because they don't cost an arm and a leg like a Vin jaune can, but they have elements of that old traditional style. And the third style is what you mentioned, working reductively, working protectively, topping up the barrels, not allowing flaw to develop, not allowing ullage in the cask, working how most... And this is another wonderful fact. Jura, as we've been talking about, is a rustic area. It's kind of backwater. Despite the fact that it's very close to Germany, it doesn't have huge amount of influence in modern winemaking until recently. So they would produce all of these oxidative wines, and they really didn't produce many non-oxidative, the third style we're talking about here for Sauvignon, the protective or reductive style. They didn't produce that. They just didn't produce much of that until recent times, in the last sort of 20, 30 years or so. And they started to produce that. They would start to top up their barrels. And they were so proud of doing this. They were like, yeah, this is a new process for us. The whole world had been doing topping up for, 1,000 years. But, since the monks, of Charlemagne had been topping up barrels. But these guys suddenly started doing it in the last 20 years. And they, in fact, label with it. You go and buy a Chardonnay from Burgundy and it doesn't tell you anything about that it's been topped up because it's actually just...
Because it's normal.
it's normal. It's a given. But in Jura, they put the French terminology for it is ouillage, which is classic French. So it's a million different vowels. So O-U-I... L-L-A-G-E, and the art of doing it is ouiller, so O-U-I-L-L with an E and an accent on it. And you'll find that on labels. The ouiller terminology you'll find on the labels.
That's actually really useful, though.
Yeah,
so the fresher style.
Exactly. So if you go into a shop that has a few Jura wines and you see 3 Sauvignons, you see one as a Vin jaune, you see one as a Tradition, and then you see one as a ouiller, and you know that you want a fresher style, a more younger, fresher style, you'll pick the latter one because it's been actually been made normally. I love that about Jura. They're just so old school that they're like, oh, what's this topping up thing? Never heard of it. Let's put it on the label, which is wonderful.
Well, listen, but that is good for the consumer to know.
Yeah, for
and
sure.
I think we've mentioned now every style, because you've also mentioned Crémant de Jura, except for Vin de Pays.
Yes.
Which is a sweet wine. That's the only one I think that we are missing to complete the set.
Yeah, in my cellar, I definitely have about 5 or 6 times the amount of Jura than I do Burgundy in my cellar. Mainly because Burgundy's kind of, it's priced itself outside of my wallet. But Jura is more accessible. So these wine styles we've been talking about, apart from probably Vin jaune, which is a bit more premium, you can pick a good bottle of Jura up at 20, 25, 30 pounds. It's decently priced. Most of them sit in that range. So let's say 20 to 35, that kind of area. And Burgundy's generally 30 to 50% more than that today. So I have a lot of experience in all those wines. Vin de Pays, I have tasted a fair few, but the few is the operative word because there aren't many producers that make it today.
Yeah.
It is where every grape, apart from Pinot Noir, is permitted to be dried on straw or bamboo or whatever you want to use.
Pays, the word means straw, doesn't it? In French?
It does,
Pays.
yeah. So this is straw wine and it's drying the grapes. Some people like Frédéric Mosset, M-O-S-S-E apostrophe, who makes, I think it's like 400 grams per litre of sugar in his Vin de Pays, but typically they're less sweet than that. But they're good. They are your raisiny style wines that you'd expect from those styles. But I've probably only tried, 5 or 6 in my lifetime. And I think there's only something like 8 or 9 producers of Vin de Paille today. So it's quite a rare style.
Okay, so, if somebody wants to really hunt it down, it exists, but it'll be a challenge.
It's like a dying ember of the tradition of wines of this area. One of the old school styles of Vin Jaune is going strong. There's the demands there for it. With Vin de Paille, there's more competition. There's not much competition
Precisely.
for Vin Jaune. And I do want to mention one thing about Vin Jaune, which I want to clear up something about it. At one time in my life, toying with doing the MW, but...
Oh, yeah, me too.
I became a winemaker, I had kids, and I've got 5 businesses, and I just felt that I didn't need to be an MW. I'm fairly...
Yeah.
I'm not tooting my own horn, but I'm fairly well accomplished in education, and it would have basically been an expense and a stressful time in my life to put MW after my word. So I was toying one time to do the MW, and I had actually come up with my thesis. My thesis was going to be on the origins of flor, of the under yeast wine styles, because I wanted to dispel what people thought about flor, because everybody immediately thinks that it is Andalusia sherry that is where this process stems from, but we have information written by Greek philosophers and also Phoenician sources that then were passed down to Greek philosophers of doing wines under this style, this process, which then ties, that's 2,000, 3,000 years ago, tying into the fact that you've got wines coming from Phoenicia to Greece being mentioned, Phoenicia, modern day Lebanon, and being brought across, and then they populated areas like the Phoenicians populated Sardinia, where we have a brilliant wine called Vernaccia di Oristano, which is underneath flor yeast as well, predating sherry. And then Vin Jaune as well. Vin Jaune would have been something which was probably more likely influenced by the Greek and the Greek Byzantines, which were the Eastern Roman Empire, and then the Romans. So it's likely that this process of under yeast would come from the Far East, by Far East, of the east of the Mediterranean, and then moved across to places like Vin Jaune in Jura and Sardinia and Sicily, where it was well known as well, and then eventually the Spanish Peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula. And I was very excited about that, but then I sat down and went, I would have gone through that. I was so passionate about writing about, but I would have gone through a whole world of pain to get to that point, and I thought, actually, no.
So, not worth it.
Forget about
but
it. But
you just expressed it now, so there we go. It's all
Somebody
good.
out there can have it if they want. They can have
there
it.
You go.
And I can tutor them through some of it if they wish.
Love that. Now, just to finish off on Jura, I think we've basically really touched on the main appellations, because we've already said Chateau Chalon, that little small area that's doing Vin Jaune. Arbois is the main one. Côte de Jura covers everything. And then there's L'Étoile, which is the star, isn't it? L'Étoile.
Exactly.
Is that just for Chardonnay?
Yes, it's a white zone. It's not just for Chardonnay, it's for Sauvignon as well. The biggest AOC is Arbois.
Yes.
That is probably just shy of 800 hectares today, and Jura is about 2,000, so you're looking at about 40%, and it's actually very famous for reds. And Arbois is, remember, centred around the town of the same name, and then famous for Louis Pasteur, who was born and bred from Arbois. And then you're right to mention Côte de Jura is the second largest. It's geographically a larger area, but more scattered in terms of its concentration of vineyards, more famous for white blends. But Vin Jaune is within that category. Chateau Chalon as well, and L'Étoile. So L'Étoile means the star for 2 reasons, really, and take your pick, really, which one you want to go with. It is on a hill which kind of looks like a star, but
I like that.
If you were to see it, you'll be like, a little bit far-fetched, but okay. And then the geology, there are fossilised remains in this part of the Jura, where they have found small accumulations of pentacrine fossils, which are 5-pointed fossils. So look a little bit...
That's probably more realistic.
A little bit more like a star, yeah. So, but they do like to say in all the marketing, it's because of 2 reasons. You've got the hill and the soil. It's an area which is near a lovely town called Arles, lovely castle there, Chateau d'Arles, and makes splendid whites. Very much more so towards traditional Sauvignon, and then more reductive, protective Chardonnay. But, once again, the word mostly or generally is employed.
If we've learnt one thing this episode, it's to always use the word generally before any statement.
It's like a legal phrase to cover your ass, isn't it?
Right, there you go, everyone. Generally, that is Jura covered. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did recording it, and we will have more from Jimmy next week. We will be taking you to the Canary Islands and mostly Tenerife, as this is the island with the most production. If you don't know of the magic coming out from these volcanic soils, you need to listen to next week's episode. Now, as always, I finish with a wine quote, and this is by Horace, the famous author and poet during the time of Augustus. And he said, "No poem was ever written by a drinker of water." And as this is the first episode back of 2023, may I take this opportunity to wish you a creative, an inspiring and joyful new year where wine takes you to new locations, where you try new food pairings, meet and make new friends, where wine makes you more curious and you continue exploring the depths of this incredible wine world. Don't forget to rate and review this podcast, share with all of your wine-loving friends, and until next week, cheers to you.